Hey guys, so today I'm going to be testing the RTX 4090. I happen to have the MSI Gaming X Trio version of the 4090. I know the 4090 is meant for people who may want to game in 4K, but at 1440p, I want to see if it's worth it to upgrade from a 4080 to a 4090. It's going to be super sicko mode. So before we get started, please like and subscribe if you enjoy watching this content. I'll continue to put out content weekly, and I'll strive to make every video as sicko mode as possible. All right, let's get to it. Just looking at the card, this card is massive. I thought my 4080 was massive, and this thing just is on another level. It's a triple slot card. The thing is, this thing is way longer.
That's what she said.
It even comes with a support bracket to support it while it's in the case, and it definitely needs it because without the support, the card sags a lot and that could damage your PCI slot as well as the card. I do like the way this card looks. I think the build quality is pretty decent. It's not the highest end 4090 you can get. In my opinion, I don't think it's the best looking 4090. I think the Aorus Master 4090 is probably the best looking one. Or if you want to go minimalistic, I do like the Founders Edition as well. This is still a pretty sicko mode looking card. I do think my AMD HD 6770, which is right here, does look better. Just kidding, this is a piece of crap. So when you're comparing this 4090 and the 4080 that I have on paper, the price point, $1,650 versus $1,200. So there's a difference of $450. GPU clock speeds are very similar. It's not really a big deal. I think the biggest difference between the cards is the amount of video memory each card has. So you have 16 gigabytes of GDDR6X on the 4080 versus 24 gigabytes on the 4090. I think that's really the key difference in this comparison. Another key difference is the amount of power the 4090 uses compared to the 4080. 4080 uses 320 watts versus the 450 watts on the 4090, which should give you better performance. Hopefully it doesn't heat up much hotter than the 4080. I guess the third major difference would be price. $1,650 can get you a really good 1440p gaming machine. For me personally, I can justify spending $1,200. $1,650, that's a little much. I know for around $1,200, I was able to build a really good 3060 Ti build. So for $1,650, I mean, you must really want to be playing in 4K and you can't have anything less, or you just want to flex. That's what I think, because you can build a really good 1440p machine for $1,650. So if we're talking about this particular build, I have an i5 13600K. I have 32 gigs of 3200 megahertz RAM as GDR4 RAM. I have a 500 gig Samsung 970 EVO, a Z690 gigabyte Aorus board. So since I've already been testing the 13600K, I'm not gonna run Cinebench. I'm mainly focusing on the GPU, comparing the 4080 and the 4090. So the first test I ran was actually the Furmark test. I wanted to see what kind of temps I get. So the Furmark test I run is a 10-minute stress test on the GPU and the CPU to generate as much heat as possible in the case. So after 10 minutes of 100% constant load, the GPU reached a high temp of 67 degrees Celsius, which is actually really good. And the 4080 in this same exact case hit 59 degrees Celsius. So 4080 was cooler, but 67 degrees is also really good. The next benchmarks I ran were the 3D Mark benchmarks. So in the Time Spy benchmark, I scored 31,089 points with the 4090 versus 25,558 on the 4080. So if you're looking at like the graphic scores, you're getting about 30% better FPS. Once again, the 4080 does get a lower temp of 58 degrees versus 64 degrees. In the Firestarker Extreme test, the 4090 got 38,593 versus 31,114 on the 4080. That's a much bigger jump. So during the graphics test, it says the first score I got about 35% better, 33%, 37% in testing. The next test I ran was the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. I was running everything at ultra settings at 1440p. It was very smooth. My FPS was hitting over 200 at times. The Shadow of the Tomb Raider depends heavily on the CPU, so I've seen a bigger difference between changing CPUs versus actually swapping on the GPU. So in the 4090 test, I did score an average FPS of 201, which is very good at 1440p, and at ultra everything, Shadow of the Tomb Raider plays very well. Now, if you move on to the Cyberpunk test, I ran everything on high, made sure psycho settings were turned on, ray tracing's on, 1440p, and during this test, this is definitely the highest FPS I've seen. It's consistently hitting above 100, and I averaged an FPS of 123 frames per second. And when you compare that to the 4080, I averaged an FPS of 95 frames per second. You get an FPS increase of about 28 points. Pretty good, pretty freaking good. I'm not sure if 28 FPS is worth an extra $450. You could buy a 3060 Ti with that for another build if you wanted to, but those are the scores. The last test I like to run is the GTA 5 test. I know it's an older game, it's about 10 years old, but it still pushes modern day graphics cards to their limits, which I find interesting. With the 4080 at the highest settings at 1440p, I was averaging between 90 and 100 frames per second. Now with the 4090, I turned up the settings as high as I could. So when I just first start, it says I'm pushing 300 watts. Whoops. I'm getting around 120 frames per second at times. GPU temps are phenomenal, only 57 degrees. FPS is consistently staying over 100. I guess if you want the best experience ever for gaming, the 4090 is what you want. To be honest, I don't see a difference between my 4080 and 4090, but I am hitting 130 frames per second, which my 4080 wasn't. Now, obviously, if I turn down some of the settings, I can hit 130, 144 frames per second. When I want everything turned up as high as possible, this is definitely the highest FPS I've gotten, which is expected. It's a 4090. I am hitting 60 degrees now, but the fact that this card is so big and massive and has 3 fans, heat is not going to be an issue. But to be honest, I don't think this is any better than my 4080, at least in this game. I am getting better FPS, but it's not really a big deal, to be honest. Now, for you 4K gamers out there, if you want to play games in 4K, this is what the 4090 is designed to do. It is better than the 4080, according to the FPS. So like I said in the beginning of the video, I'm comparing the 4090 to my 4080. I want to see if it's worth upgrading to 4090, if I could see a difference. While running benchmarks, I did score higher. Some of the 3D Mark benchmark tests, I was getting 30% frames per second better. Now while gaming Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I was getting around 200 frames per second. My 4080 gets above 144 frames per second, so after that, I can't see a difference. So it's not really a big deal. Now, if I was gaming in 4K, the 4090 would definitely be the way to go. Now with Cyberpunk, I got 123 frames per second, much better than 95 frames per second. It's closer to that 144 frames per second mark that I want to hit. And now GTA 5, it was a similar situation. With the 4080, however, in the 90s, and with the 4090, I was consistently hitting 130 frames per second. My heat is still good. I'm not generating a lot of heat. It does use a little more power. Is it worth the upgrade from 4080 to a 4090 at 1440p for $450 more? Definitely not. If you're gaming at 1440p, especially at 1080p, the 4080 is really what you want. There is no need to go to 4090. Now, for you 4K gamers, first question, why are you gaming in 4K? If you have the money, sure, go ahead. You can game in 4K. If you want the best PC you can build, the 4090 is the way to go. For me, I already have a 4080. I only game in 1440p. There's not really a need to go to the 4090. It's a nice to have, or really more of a flex, I would say. To me, I can justify spending $1,200 on a GPU for gaming, but $1,650 is a lot. There are some 4090s where the MSRP is $2,000, like the Asus ROG version. That's pretty spicy. The card does look pretty sicko mode though. Just by looking at it, the 4090 does look better in this H9 Elite case. In my opinion, I don't think the 4090 at 1440p is necessary. Like I said, I can't justify spending $450 more for better benchmark scores. I do get better FPS in games. Can't really see it. Maybe if I try really hard, I can maybe see it. There's a very minimal difference in the games. 4080 is an awesome GPU. I really like it. At $1,200, it is still a really pricey GPU. For 1440p, it'll still play any game without issue. That's my take on the 4090 for 1440p gaming. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And once again, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. I will be putting content out weekly. I will make it as sicko mode as possible. And like always, have a sicko mode day.